right? I'm not going to talk about academic social support, at least not directly, because it flows in from some of the other things I want to get to, one of which is the point that already been made. Virtually all of the research points to this directly or indirectly. This is very difficult to comprehend, so I'll go slow. The more students do the right things, the more likely they are to succeed. Ta-da! I'll take the check now. We can cut this short. Yeah, involvement in the right kinds of activities. It's what the data show. Probably shows so in your own life. Ernie Pascarella and Pat Teranzini, my friends, the Pizza Brothers, you know these people? Twice in our lifetimes. How many of you have one of the two volumes? You know, they did one in 91 and one in 2005. Just raise your hand. Just look around the room. We want to see where the smart people are. And now, how many of you have actually read the whole thing? I mean, even Ernie and Pat haven't read the whole thing. It's 650. That's why they co-authored this, I think. But the point of this is, they have done a substantial favor for us all by distilling what we know matters to the kinds of outcomes we are after, right? Now, we can't make many unequivocal conclusions about human behavior. I mean, that's just so. But one of the few things we can say unequivocally about learning and student success in college is that, yeah, individual effort, very important, but we make a difference by how we organize the in-class and out-of-class experience of students. Bob King has already mentioned, if we don't ask students to write, you want to complete the phrase? They don't write very well. And we can, of course, complain about the fact that they come in to college today not writing very well. And we can pretend that in some earlier era, like let's say when we were in high school, we got to college and we were expert writers, which is baloney, of course, if you look back at your own, first-year comp papers. But the point here is we can organize the curriculum and to a meaningful extent the out-of-class experience in ways that induce, cajole, I'm going to use several times before I'm done with you, require students to do things. We could require students to take 3 or 4 writing-intensive courses if we chose to. And there are institutions that do so. Because, I don't know where they got this idea, but they think they're supposed to produce people who can write, and the only way it's going to well, all right, get the point. The only way it's going to happen is if they get practice. Practice. I'm going to talk more about writing in the follow-up session, and so no one will probably come. And of course, as has already been mentioned, what goes on in the 80% of students' waking hours that they are not in class or a lab or a studio is really huge. So the work, not just of student affairs professionals, librarians, IT people, custodians. How many librarians in the room? We've kept them locked out again. This is, well, why don't you tell us about your undergraduate experience? Let's go back to that. Yeah, librarians, like some of the other people I've just mentioned, have a very informed, in a different way, view of the student experience than many of us who see them only in other aspects, because they show up in the library, or wherever librarians work today, I don't know. And they're pretty vulnerable. I mean, they ask you things that if their teachers heard them ask you this, they would wonder whether the person is coming to class. Very vulnerable. And of course, if you want to know what's happening in terms of the social life of students, you talk with the custodial staff. These are called behavioral traces, the stuff that they leave in trash cans and other places. But the point of all this is we've got to be thinking in this broad, holistic way about the student experience, knowing that what they do outside of class, I mean, if it is true that students spend that many number of hours social, it's clear they're spending all this time outside of class. How do we channel that? And in part, it is channeled by the expectations we put on them in class. So this is not beyond our capability of understanding. When we can control statistically, in our little research model, when we control for who students are, it's not where they went to high school or what their grades were. I mean, yeah, we know students are more likely to succeed if they've got higher test scores and better grades, but in terms of how much they learn, which was a point that we're really struggling with to adequately measure authentic learning at the post-secondary level. It's not who they are, it's what they do. That's true of every aspect of our lives, isn't it? Some institutions do empirically identify better jobs at channeling student behavior because of what they ask students to do. Not just encourage or soft, be nice if. Kinds of curricular requirements they set up, the kinds of expectations, the out-of-class experiences that complement in class. And so that's what we're really after. How do we not just mimic, but make meaningful in our own context, both 2-year and 4-year, getting students to do the things that matter. We know what these things are. These ideas have great face validity once they're briefly discussed. State legislators understand these words, family, parents, even students. Now, not all of these are as self-evident as we would expect. We've already heard the long-standing belief, for example, this first bullet, don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of these, that, said another way, wasn't said quite this way, but the more contact students have with faculty, the better. You believe that? You do? Should never fall for that leading question. Well, it is not, apparently from the research anyway, it is not the frequency of contact that students have with their teachers or staff. It's what transpires during that exchange. I'll repeat after me. We have data to show that students who report, this is NESE, there's some other data points here, students who report having the most contact with their faculty also report learning the least. And the satisfaction piece that Aaron mentioned is also slightly down from campus average. We can explain this. This is not because faculty are bad people, and it's not because students are bad people, but the students who tend, especially in the first years, who have the most contact with faculty, are those who are struggling. They're coming in to try to understand what the expectations are, why their papers are receiving such poor grades. Turns out that neither students or faculty are particularly pleased with the exchange, but of course it's critical. This kind of work, feedback, is critical. So we want to be careful here, for example, about policies and practices that push people into contact without intentionally, clearly thinking through what we would like to have happen as a result of these kinds of programs. We can go down this list. I'm not going to go down this list. I'm going to come back and maybe illustrate it through some examples, campus-based examples. But one of the things that's already been mentioned in terms of what employers want from us, they want people, I'm looking now at this last bullet here, phrased cooperation. They want people who know, who've got experience, who've got demonstrated competence, right, in working with other people, and especially people who are different than them. Where does this, where do students learn how to work effectively with others? Thank you for laughing out loud. It's so important to get somebody laughing out loud. And this ain't it. This is not it. I mean, Academically Adrift has done one important thing, and it's really focused attention on, some really worrisome patterns, both on our part and on students' part. But one of the things they got wrong because of one question they asked, is the power of active and collaborative learning. They conjured up a question that said, how often do you study with other students? That's the one question they asked. I'm irritated at those guys for this. And then early on they made a big deal of it, and later they say nothing about it because they know they got it wrong. It's not about how much time students spend working with others. It is, again, how is this activity set up? What's the intentional structure that's given to it? Is it happening inside and out of class? Is the instructor mediating, offering principles and guidelines for this work? Are people in the group taught to play different roles? So that in an iterative way, people get different kinds of experiences. I mean, you can't get there without this kind of stuff. So this is not about count off by 8 in the classroom, go off for 20 minutes, come back and tell us what you talked about, see you next week. That's not it. This has become an artful science, this active and collaborative learning stuff. These were the ideas that drove us into this NESI work. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Probably everybody in the room has done either NESI, the 4-year version, or SESI, the 2-year version, right? Short surveys, they don't ask, unfortunately, for media attention. They don't, no questions on there about sex, drugs, rock and roll. It's just stuff that matters to student learning, right? And it's a pretty gross indicator, really. I mean, generally speaking, it's a bunch of questions taken from the research. Doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the quality, the nature and the quality of the student experience at your place, but it is a conversation starter. And when you can, as we've heard earlier, begin to drill down from the institution level to major field, churn up the data by race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status. Are you on an intercollegiate athletic team? You're part of a fraternity or sorority. When you begin to break out the data, you begin to illuminate patterns that may be promising and patterns that may be disappointing, and that's perhaps where you would target some additional effort, right? Why did we do this, and what have we found? We did it because we knew this is what we would find, because the research had already pointed us in this direction, that the more engaged a student is, the more that they do the things that matter from the research, the things that matter to their learning, their grades are better. Now, grades aren't everything, but it's one of the markers that we use, right? The more they are, the grades are better. They are happier. Well, happy is maybe an overstatement, but they are, generally speaking, more satisfied with the college experience. And no surprise, it would lead them to stay, finish what they started here, sometimes elsewhere, and they also benefit in ways that we want. Win, 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 win. Now, this is on average. You know, there are many students at our institutions that are highly engaged and they leave for various reasons. But on average, if you're going to go with the averages, if you are, anybody's betting on the game tonight, I bet that figuring out, putting money that will induce students to spend more time on stuff that matters will give you the return that we're looking for. So you got a person who's seen a lot of Kentucky basketball catching you off guard by providing an analysis of what Calipari ought to do, right, with his team, and you least expect it from that person. There's a lot of stuff that we don't know, and it gets more complicated, like many of the things that we say are true are more true for some groups than others. We call this, see, you didn't think you'd get all this really good stuff today, right? We call this a conditional effect. Some people, some groups benefit more from certain kinds of activities than others. Conditional. Hold that thought. When we compensate for something, this is audience quiz now. This is an opportunity to show people at the council how smart you are. When we compensate for something, what do? We make adjustments for what? Shortcomings. When we compensate for something, we make adjustments for things that we are not maybe as good as we either like to be or others are, right? Engagement has a compensatory effect, and I'll come back to that, because for Kentucky to meet its goals, you are going to have to squeeze higher levels of achievement out of students, many of whom have been written off already because of who they are, not because of what they can do or attain. Hang on to that thought. And finally, some of the things that virtually all of our institutions offer to a limited number of students have huge positive effects for almost everyone who does them. This last bullet. All right, you ready? Now we're really going to get into the fun here. Just in one moment, we're going to have some, this is really going to be great, we're going to have some data slides. But first, the easy stuff. So on average, you know, this is the conditional effect stuff. On average, these groups of students tend to spend more time doing the right things. Women, who'd have thunk? Wow, where did that come from, right? Women tend to spend more time studying. They spend more time interacting with their peers across differences. Women, on average, right? On average, and on average becomes more important than recognizing that we're talking about averages, becomes more important than just this slide this morning. Because the comparisons we make, institutional comparisons, major field comparisons, virtually every comparison we make up and down the educational ladder, starting with blue ribbon schools of excellence, you know, whatever they are, elementary schools, high schools, through colleges, through whatever, are based on numerical averages. How many of you have been to Lake Wobegon? Where all the children are, what are they? Above average, yeah, boy, that's a place you want to be. Well, it turns out that no place is, I mean, you got places that are above average, but you also have, man, that's bad. You also have a lot of people at schools that are above average that are below average. So when we talk about helping parents and prospective students make wise choices about where they should go to college, and they use whatever these numbers are that NESE or US News or whatever reports, it really makes a difference as to who that student is. You know, are they, well, you get the point here. I mean, always half of the distribution is going to be below, and some of those folks at the below average schools are doing gangbuster work. Remember Tony Carnevale saying it doesn't matter where you go? It's what you get out of it. Very important. Okay, so not all women are more engaged than all men. Not all full-time students are, yada, yada, yada. But, and we know why these things, full-time students are in our, in close proximity to us more of the time. Which brings me to almost my all-time favorite word, propinquity. When we move resources closer to students more of the time and design them in ways that induce cajole, require them to use the resources, whatever it might be, students end up benefiting. Oh, well, okay, you can go through this. I probably ought to just say a word about this fourth bullet, the students who interact with people from different social, racial, income backgrounds, and how powerful that effect is. As I think Aaron said, the biggest bump on appreciation for diversity when you look at student data is in the first year of college. And it is this year when more students are more likely to experience what happens in a Quaker community. In Quaker communities, who's our great Quaker educator, philosopher? What's his name? Parker Palmer. Is that what you said? Parker Palmer. I don't know if you've ever heard Parker Palmer, but he's known to say that living in a Quaker community is that place where you are living next door to the person you least want to be next door to. Ba-dum-bum. Well, this is what happens on college campuses. With any college campus with a residential component, you've now got people living in close proximity, and they are bumping into different folks all the time. And this is mildly problematic for some students who have difficulty managing the nature of challenging human relations, working, living with people who they've never experienced before. But boy, does it have a huge, powerful effect, especially if those students stay and finish. We can talk more about that another time, perhaps. And not just NESI data, but data from other research programs are showing this powerful effect. But that first year is challenging, can be messy. I almost use the word tricky, but I've been told not to do that because it is, the returns are so powerful, but there are also challenges. All right, get going here. CESI data, and you can't read this either. I don't know, but you can if you're in the first 2 rows. I'm just showing the CESI slide because the same patterns exist from the 4-year sector to the 2-year sector. And you can pull this stuff off the CESI website. Women are more engaged. Students who have taken and completed developmental courses. And I'm going to talk more about developmental courses in a little bit because it's a very important strategy. Anyway, these are the slides you've been waiting for. There are 3 of these slides. And recall I mentioned compensatory effect. Compensatory effect, and what you can't see, it's bleeding off the bottom of the screen there. The horizontal axis, as we call it, the bottom line here, is our measure of engagement, all right? So this 0 represents NESI data averaged across different kinds of institutions. So this is the average of engagement. And these people are less engaged. These people are more engaged, expressed in standard deviation units, if anybody cares. And by the way, I think you've got this represented in a handout in your packets. So this would be an opportunity just to put your head down and close your eyes. These are actual end of first year grades taken from transcripts. 23,000 students, right? And we got 3 groups of students here who are represented by their incoming so-called pre-college achievement, right? We got a green line of students who on average had an ACT score of 20, and then the red line rather is the 24, and the highest scoring group is the blue line, okay? So we got, in essence, we got ACT scores by their earned GPA and by engagement. So there are, for our purposes this morning, there are 2 key takeaways from this display. Who's willing to give me 1? 2 key takeaways to the extent you can make out the displays. Students with the lowest ACT score seem to benefit the most from engagement, thereby closing the gap, as you said. Nice. Yeah, my first takeaway is if you squint at the slopes of the lines, they all go in the desired direction. They're not nearly as sharp as we'd like. But these are real students at real institutions taking lots of different courses, right? So engagement benefits everybody, but the students who get the greatest bump, I'll call it a compensatory bump from engagement, are those who are, by this measure anyway, less well prepared for college. Now, fortunately, I know none of you admit students with 20 ACT scores, so it's probably irrelevant. Liar. This is a different, the chart is the same setup, grades by engagement, and now we've got 2 groups of students. I was not surprised by the first finding. This surprised me, that Hispanic students, who in this data set were in the numerical minority, would overtake white students in terms of their academic performance the more engaged they became. A compensatory effect for what is for many of our campuses, an at-risk group. I hope you're not offended by the words I'm using here. A surprising compensatory effect to me. Last slide. This is a little different in that on the vertical axis here, we have the odds that a student is going to come back to the same campus for a second year. So this is first to second year persistence by engagement, looking at two groups. And again, in this data set, African American students were on most of the campuses in the numerical minority. A group whose graduation rates typically does not approach that of the majority white student, and yet the more engaged these students became, the more likely they are, at least to return for that second year. Engagement has a compensatory effect, providing a boost for the students who could most benefit from it. Remember, everybody's benefiting, right? The slopes of the lines for all groups go in the desired direction, but certain groups, once we can figure out how to entrap them into the good stuff, benefit. All right. I foreshadowed this before. This last set of kind of conditional outcomes is that if you've done what we're calling today, you know, when you make up a phrase, then you get published. So bear that in mind. When you've done a high-impact practice, you are more likely to benefit across the board in engagement, outcomes, all the good stuff. Here's a monograph that makes a great Easter gift if you're looking for something to quickly download and share with family and friends if you so observe that date. How can I put this to make myself sound smarter than I am? All right, I'll tell the truth. We bumped into this. We were churning up. You know, this is what sociologists do, right, Aaron? We were just goofing around, you know. What'll spill out of all this data we have? And we found that on our list of what we called at the time enriching educational experiences, there were a bunch that really made, or at least are associated with huge differences. And you have this list in your packet. In fact, you've got a brief description of each of these that AAC&U has now kind of put their stamp of approval on. And when we started this, and when we've got the initial findings, then we started asking people elsewhere. Well, like the Ernie Pascarella and Pat Teranzini's, you know, do you see any patterns in your data? And the answer was yes. Yeah, now that you pointed out, holy crap, we're finding the same kinds of benefits for students who have done just one of these things. And I want to play with your mind a little bit, because what you should do is just let your eyes roll through that list. You may use slightly different words to describe an activity or an experience. You know, for example, how many of your campuses have a learning community?